exciting to be here today. And I just want to frame how I'm giving this talk because I'm right in the middle of a project. I'm actually in my mobile studio, which you can kind of see behind me. There's some prints hanging up. And so I'm in a 19-foot travel trailer and I'm in the Sonoran Desert. And Crystal and I did some tech checks because I'm hot spotting off one tower and then trying to run my notes off another tower. So if we have any technical problems, just give me 10 minutes or 10 seconds and I'll switch to another tower. So this has been a really interesting year, obviously, for everyone in technology. And now I feel like I'm on the road, which is amazing. And so actually engaging technology while being out in the field, this will be first. So welcome to that. So I just want to thank Peninsula School of Art for bringing me here, and I'm really excited to teach the workshop in the fall on Cyanotype. And so just with that in mind, I've organized this talk to just introduce a few bodies of work, and some of them I'm just going to touch on and not go into great depth about, but just to kind of show you about the breadth of place and performance throughout my work, and as well to introduce the Cyanotype process and how I use it that might make you kind of think about how we might do that together in September if you attend the workshop. So I'm going to go ahead and screen share. So I always love to start my talk with a very heavy subject, but I'm going to read you, and some of you have been to my talks before. I just want to read a little excerpt from a letter that I wrote to my father that's just going to kind of lay the framework to Hatsubon, which is the first work I'm going to talk about. The whole letter's on my website if you feel to read it. I've been thinking for a long time about how to tell this story. You and I have always loved water and share an affinity with boats, ships, and water-faring vessels. People don't want to die. It's hard to be there when someone you love is dying, but I do not dream of being anywhere else. I remember it was only a few days before your last one with us, although we could not have known it then. You asked me, what are we going to do with all of our things? I asked, these things, gesturing around the room. Yes, if we are leaving, what should we do with them? I said, I don't think we need to do anything. We can leave them right here. We won't be needing them. You paused and then you asked me, how are we going to get there? I will never forget this moment trying to imagine what you were seeing when you said there. I knew you were talking about a place outside of this visible world, some place on the other side of the thin veil that separates us, the living, from the dead. How are we going to get there? Yes. I guess we can travel however we want. I began to list the more usual ways of travel and ended with, we could set forth by boat. You went quiet and I reflected on all the trips we had taken together as a family. Finally, you looked at me and asked, how would you go? You know me, Dad. I love boats. I would go by boat. You smiled and said, that sounds good. Evening came and eventually you fell asleep and I settled down on the couch for the night. Bring me the oar, you called out. I woke suddenly, leaping from the couch. Your eyes were open and you were looking upwards. I came to the bedside. You were looking right at me, but I was not sure if you were really seeing me. I knew what you were asking for. I laid my hand on your arm and your eyes closed and you returned to sleep or to whatever world you already had one foot in. I have thought every day of this since you've been gone, of you calling out, bring me the oar. I think about how I should make you one and how I would like to make you a boat too. So Hatsubon is a memorial to my father and evokes rituals from a cultural tradition. The story of the oar really guided me to make this work. And the whole work is really a lot about place and ritual. So Hatsubon, Obon is a ritual celebration of the first anniversary of a death of a loved one and occurs during Obon. Obon is the time of year in the Japanese Buddhist calendar when the worlds between the living and the dead is rendered permeable when our loved ones return to visit. We welcome them with gifts of food, illuminate the darkening hours with lanterns, and give thanks for the ancestors whose lives made our own possible. And this is actually a scene there. My mother took a picture of me dancing. One of the rituals for the deceased is the sending of a small vessel. I would like to make a boat for Dad, I told my sister and my mother, and we can send it to sea together. I would also like to make pictures. Of course you do, my mother said. And so they both agreed to be part of this project. I went to the garden of a friend and cut some bamboo, spliced it, soaked in hot water, and coaxed it in the shape of a skeleton boat. I took kozo, a common Japanese paper made from mulberry, and on a hot plate waxed it with beeswax. I prepared all the parts and flat packed it so that we could take it to Hawaii. And that's my mother in my grandmother's house in Hawaii. So this work explores the dynamic tension between tradition and performance through photographs and objects. It lives in the diaphanous space between life and death. The materiality of the work suggests the dualities of the fleeting and the lasting, the ephemeral and the corporeal, and the pendulous state between longing and release. Hatsubone also visits 3 geographic sites throughout the work. Pennsylvania, my father's birthplace; Hawaii, my mother's birthplace, where my father's buried and where a lot of these photographs take place; and California, where my parents met and where I was born. So when it was time to bury my father's ashes, we wanted to place his remains in an urn, and my mother kind of handed this decision to my sister and I. We immediately decided on wood, which is a material my father really loved, and I worked with a woodworker to design this urn, which is basically kind of based on Japanese elements from the temple. And it's made with Douglas fir, a very common tree seen from my father's bedroom window, and quila, which is a warm redwood. And it's just a piece that feels so much like him. My sister and I sewed our yukata, which are the cotton kimonos we're wearing here in this image. It's my mother, my sister, and then myself. I'm the youngest. And on the dawn of Hatsubone, we sent the boat to sea from the shores of Hawaii in his honor. My cousin David agreed to help on the camera as a camera assistant on the 4x5, which I'll show you a picture of in a minute. After only a few minutes of training, when I realized I would need an assistant. And so this is what would be considered the first mistake, which is a light leak on the film. And I cried when I first saw this picture, and now it's actually become one of my most important pictures in the work. So I guess it becomes one of those happy mistakes, if you will. So the time when the light is perfect for dawn is a very, very narrow window. Hatsubone was a ritual, and although carefully selected and staged, the ritual took precedence over the image making. As the sun rose, we were in the surf. The boat was set to sea. On the other side of the Pacific, on the California coast, the place my parents met and where I was born, I saw in the landscape a sense of departure and return, where the river runs to the sea in its ever-cycling nature. So just a little bit on being guided. I shared the story of the oar. So just a few weeks before we were going to Hawaii for Obon and to bury my father, I was scheduled to have a show in Pennsylvania, which had been organized like well over a year in advance before I knew all of this was going to happen. And I proposed to the curator that I finish this work and show it for the first time. So I was meeting with Chris McGinnis for my site visit in Pennsylvania, and I realized that the gallery was very close to my father's birthplace. And there were very few stories he told us growing up, but one of them was this river that he would talk about that he used to swim and play in as a child. And so I asked Chris, can we go to this river and to this town? And he says, I live in that town. That's where you're going to be staying. So I had this opportunity to take the symbol of the urn and to take it to the river, kind of in a homecoming for him. So these tiny pictures, they were taken during our last months together. Most of them are from when he was living. I call this kind of area the reliquary. And I printed them really small. They're about 4 by 4 inches, and I placed them in heavy walnut frames, creating weight as if it was the body. I couldn't help but selecting walnut because that was his favorite. And when we were children, we planted 2 walnut trees in the yard so that he could always have his favorite nuts. I like walnuts too. But really kind of just being guided by all the things that are memories of a person that you want to carry forth. So I'm just going to run through these images here. These are all made with a medium format film camera. I hope this image is not hard to see. On his last day, after he was no longer breathing, we washed his body, shaved his whiskers, cut his hair, changed the bedding, and dressed him in his favorite shirt. My mother said to me, "It's time for you to take your picture." I was taken by surprise by this request. I hadn't thought of it, but I intuitively reached for my Rolleiflex, an old medium format film camera. Although I took this image, I was not able to process the film for almost a year later. And I just want to make a note with these images. I really talked with my family before deciding to show them because they were so deeply intimate. There were other things happening in my life as all of this was happening. And I just wanted to step back a little bit in time before the images of the urn, before the kind of ritual images made during Hatsubon. You know, because art making's never really, occasionally it's a linear logical process, but most of the times it runs itself in various circles and you circle back on yourself, and that's part of the exciting part of making. I had been invited as a visiting artist and curator in residence at California Institute of Integral Studies in San Francisco. And I arrived in July, only a few weeks after he had passed away. I had been taking photographs and bits and pieces along the way, which is what some of these are. That winter, I drove to Seattle for the holidays to spend our first holiday without my father. That's where my mother and my sister and my nieces are. And on the way back to San Francisco, I drove along the coast, taking my time, stopping to take walks and search for some peace in the clouds, the waves, the rain, the dark blanket of the forest, the wet earth under my feet. It seemed I only needed time and quiet, and I would feel better again. I made pictures out of a need and did not think about looking at them in any way other than a form of respite, as if it were a journal I was pouring my sorrow into. So later, when I reflected on these images, I thought that I'd like to include a couple of them into Hatsubon. So I'm going to share those with you now, the pine, the sun, and the pine bow. The sun ray after a rain, and the tide pulling away. So I'm just going to switch a little bit about process. So maybe some of you are wondering, I'm mentioning film and this 4x5. This is my trusty steed, although it's a little bit on the back burner right now, although I did photograph it with the other day. It's a 4x5 film camera. It's a press camera. It's a pretty old kind of beater camera, although I have other lenses that I often work with. These cameras are kind of close to my heart. And so here in the top image is on a rainy day under an umbrella at the Shokin Reservoir in New York. And on the bottom would be one of the resulting 4x5 film images. This is from my residency in San Francisco, where I was working on watershed in the Bay Area. And that's actually from the kayak on the San Francisco Bay. And then on the bottom, you can kind of almost see the image that I had turned around to make a photograph of, which I'll have to say from the kayak, because I've gotten better at it and I haven't fallen in yet. So this is in Polo Valley. It's one of a really special kind of place. It's an ancestral home for us. And my cousin David, the one who had helped on camera, took these. So just kind of an idea of how I might be working. So coming back to this image of the ore and the sun ray, this is, I'm going to show you a couple installation images just to show how it all came together. This is in Northlight Gallery in Phoenix in 2019. So I've been trying to work for about 4 years now. Yeah, almost 5. But this is one of my most complete installations I feel really excited about. So I'll share this one with you. So I chose to print 4 key images on these large silk, you know, to allow it to be like that veil, that kind of diaphanous space between the living and the deceased. So there's kind of 4 key images on that. And then other images I chose to continue to frame in the walnut and allow them to be more physical objects. On the left, you can see that diptych of the Monongahela River, and on the right's the reliquary. And each time that I install the work, it's different depending on the space. Sometimes the reliquary almost gets its own room. In this sense, it just has a little spotlight on it. There are also some objects that guide you through the work. There are these cast porcelain boats that also sit on some walnut shelves and made to complement, to kind of guide you and lead you through the place. So it's almost like the installation, when I can have it work exactly how I love it to work, kind of works in time. So as you're moving through the place, you're kind of going through the almost like the pacing of the ritual within. Just so this is, so I didn't have enough boat. I didn't make enough boats for my father yet, and I really wanted to make one to float. But I started to make this framework for this skeleton boat, or I mean, started to make the skeleton for this boat. And then when I got to this point, I actually just loved how simple it was, so I kept it there. It's actually the length of his body, and the oar is the height of my body. So this is about 91 inches long, and it's made with the leftover cherry from the wood and ash. And so the ash is steam bent, and I selected that because it's often called the tree of life in the Gaelic tradition, which reflects the Jones side of my family. All around Hatsubone's really was really from the Takatani side of the family. Also, because the urn became interred, I felt like I really loved it as a ritual, as an object to include in Hatsubon. So I worked with that same woodworker, and after a lot of practice cutting dovetails, made a very small version with also with the leftover wood from the urn that he had still held on to. So this is pretty small. It's 5 3/4 by 4 by 3 3/4. So it's just a little small kind of miniature version. There's also a video aspect to it, and it also comes in threes. So it references the 3 geographic sites, Pennsylvania, Hawaii, and California. And also I feel like there's this real repetition of 3 in my mother and my sister and I, like the 3 kind of women around him. And the reflecting pools are meant to kind of reference the Toba, which is a memorial tablet used in the Buddhist tradition, but also to consider places like the Washington Monument or the Hiroshima Peace Museum, where these reflecting pools are meant to be memorials. And actually, I watched the COVID memorial, which took place at the Washington Monument. I don't know if anyone watched that. It was really powerful for all the Americans who've passed from COVID-19. Was really touched by that, and it's on the reflecting pool at the Washington on the mall, right, with all the candles lit or all the lanterns lit. So to me, it felt very much like that kind of honoring of the deceased. Here are the 3 sites, Pennsylvania on the left, the Pacific Coast, actually on my father's birthday in the center, and then on the right it's from an underwater video at the site that we launched the boat from. And just another install image. And in this installation, there's a couple of the porcelain boats actually floating on the water, which is the first time I've done that. I created them to float, but I hadn't quite used this. So that's Hatsubo. Now I'm just going to switch into a little bit about Cyanotype Process and then talk about how I integrated that into my work. And so my talk is actually exactly half an hour, but we took a little while to get started, so I might skip over a few images. So the Cyanotype process, some of you may be familiar with, like any kind of photographic process, photography, meaning writing with light or drawing with light, requires a light source, a UV light source. It's nice to have a sheet of glass to hold your negative or your object down if it's holdable. Say it's not like a golf ball, something you can't crush with a sheet of glass. Then you have your negative or your object, and then on your bottom part would be your light sensitized paper. So whether it's photographic material, in this case, I'm coating with a cyanotype material. And then here's the week before I moved from California to Wisconsin, and I was really sad about leaving the redwoods and went on a walk with my friend, and we picked up objects. And of course, the feather and the leaf is the classic things to make a cyanotype with. So why not? I made them on my porch. And so just so you can see that in action, there's the glass, right? The feather, the leaf, and then the cyanotype paper that's been binder clipped next to the cast foot. And those are 2 individual images. So I think I made one of each, and then I made an image of them together. So just to kind of illustrate really the simplicity of the process. There's a close-up of the feather. Well, maybe I won't skip the fox. I'm going to share the fox because it was recently in the gallery, right? I see Crystal laughing. I don't know if it's hard for people to see. So There's a lot of memorial and loss and death in my work, as you can probably see already. And this is the story of the fox. It's been a sad week seeing so many animals struck on the road. The intoxication of spring has perhaps made them too lively, and they forget the danger of humans. This sweet fox was warm when I went to pull her off the road. She was a young mother. I felt she needed a burial in honor of her life and made a memorial imprint. It's not an ideal day for cyanotypes. The sun dips behind the clouds and the wind blows everything, everywhere. The paper, my hair, her fur, the stream of water from the outdoor shower, everywhere. The lizards and hummingbirds and my bird crush, the Pacific flycatcher, are here to keep our spirits up. Later, Kate will come over and we'll bury the fox on the hillside with a view facing west as the sun sinks below the ridge. So that's the resulting image. I'm going to just touch on water lines because it's also about the cyanotype process, but using both kind of objects, but definitely using the negative. So here is a very classic picture. I won't give you a quiz, but Yosemite Valley. I almost didn't take this picture because everyone's taken this picture, but my collaborator insisted that I not appropriate Ansel Adams. So this is with a 4x5 field camera. So I'm using both photographic negatives and objects in this work. So here is and by the way, all this work that I'm showing you was made when I was living in Northern California, also in kind of a cabin-like situation with a couple of solar panels. So a lot of my processes I was working with were very simple and I couldn't require a ton of technology or a lot of electricity. So I really, really enjoyed working with the sun. And in some ways, that's what I'm doing here, except I'm a little more sophisticated this time around. So this is the cyanotype material being painted onto the paper, and then the negative, just making a simple contact print. The painting was done by Jonathan Marquis, my collaborator, who's a painter. So that would be like a resulting print from that process. And I'll just read you our statement that we wrote about this project, Water Lines. It's also about watershed and climate. Water is a tangled history. After more than 5 years of severe drought in California, this year's winter storms brought an incredible amount of rain and snowfall. Come spring, the unprecedented precipitation brought relief to the drought-stricken region, but along with water came a new set of concerns: floods, infrastructure damage, cracking dams, and overflowing reservoirs. Water Lines is a response to the urgencies of water in the age of extreme weather and climate change. How do shifts in weather and the fluctuation of scarcity to abundance shape the climate of behavior? When and where does it become personal? This work began with a 4x5 field camera to document sites of water containment, regulated flow, and public use. So the top is would be kind of a classic black and white photograph. It scans from the negatives, and then the bottom's the cyanotype, just to show you that process. It's so interesting now to read this and think about what's happening in Texas, right? Here's just kind of a process image. So after we would make the negative cyanotype, we would recoat the paper, add a second layer, and take that existing images and then bring it to the Pacific coast and kind of manipulate it with sand and stone and seaweed and what other kind of elements we could bringing that fresh water to seawater, just like making that line of connection. So this will be one of the resulting images. And another one, this is at the sea. So we followed it from Hetch Hetchy, which is the drinking water supply of San Francisco, to the sea. So following that water line. And I'm just going to touch really quick on Rattlesnake Lake, which you mentioned in my bio, because I just want to suggest that this idea of using source water and working with materials on site is a really long running practice for me in my work. And Rattlesnake Lake is maybe one of the first times I really engaged. Well, it wasn't the first time, but I guess where I was really becoming conscious of it, which I started in 2005. So it's a very long-term project. It's Rattlesnake Lake is part of the Cedar River watershed, which is the drinking water supply of the city of Seattle, whereas one of my homes. I guess it's where my family lives, and I lived for about 20 years. I'll read you a little bit about the statement from that. The human histories embedded in our landscapes are uneasy and unresolved. When I first went to Rattlesnake Lake, it smelled of summer and promised happy memories. On a winter day, my birthday, I returned to the lake. It is January, and the drizzle will not let up as the mist rolls in the growing dark. There is nothing left but a mud puddle and 100 enormous stumps. Once an indigenous site, the area was deforested and a town built, which was later destroyed by flooding. Today, the lake is an overflow reservoir of drinking water for the city of Seattle. The boundary between land and lake blurs as the water rises and falls, both revealing and hiding its history. In Rattlesnake Lake, an embodiment of spirit imagined is a lone figure moving through a place of untold stories. A bucket of water is collected from the lake to rinse the photographic film. Dirt and leaves rub together and onto the film, leaving artifacts behind and tearing small pieces of silver away, a conversation between place and image. The series is photographed with the field camera, that 4x5 field camera. And a style very much used by 19th century surveys of the Western landscape by European settlers, and printed as platinotypes, which is an alchemical mix of platinum and palladium that's hand-coated onto paper and exposed to ultraviolet light, much like the cyanotype, but a little bit fussier. So I'm trying to throw a little humor in there, a little fussier, a lot more expensive. So you're a little more careful with it. My father actually took this picture with hit the shutter for me. It was one of the last times that he was still able to go out and do things. And he's like, "You're always going to Rattlesnake Lake." I'm like, "Come with me." So this image feels important in those ways. So there's more images in the series. I just wanted to show you a few. And I'm just gonna jump through this one quickly because this watershed and using source water continues. You've already seen this image. So this is Ashokan Reservoir, which is the drinking water supply for the city of New York. 9 million people drink out of this reservoir every day, which seems crazy. And its sister system is the Cedar River. So actually Washington and New York are tied by having very similar aqueduct systems. They're the only ones that are like that in the whole US, which was so surprising. I stopped by and talked to the Department of Water in New York, and they told me that. So I wasn't planning on making cyanotypes. In fact, I had convinced a fisherman to take me out on a rowboat that was allowed on the reservoir because no motorboats and you have to have a registered boat. And I had bribed him with $50 in cash and a 6-pack of beer to take me out, and he agreed, but he needed to go get bait. So while he ran up to go get some worms, right, he's like, "I can't fish without some live bait." So he went up to get worms, and I was waiting for him for about 40 minutes on the shore. I see Ray laughing. Ray's like, "This is all how you always are, right? You gotta work it, right? Like, how is somebody gonna get out in the water without a lot of permits, which, you know, by then my residency will be over." So I scooped up some bubbles and some water while I was waiting for him. And I always, ever since doing water lines with Jonathan, I always carry like a bag of 4x4, like little paper hand coated in my bag so that I'm like ready to make a cyanotype if the mood hits. So it ended up being like kind of my favorite project from the reservoir. I took a lot of like photographs, but I really loved the way the bubbles acted as a negative. Which Tara Donovan, if you know her work, I was really moved by her etchings and what she did that. And Megan Riepenhoff is like kind of the queen of cyanotypes as far as like using source water. And now I want to I haven't actually talked publicly about this work. This image here on the right is a poster designed for these ground places. So it's integrating cyanotype, place, some of my 4x5 work, the kind of performance and self-portrait on the landscape. As you see, I'm working a lot in the land, and in particular, I'm almost always working in public land, but I don't have it necessarily, you know, watersheds and various places that we consider kind of communal shared land, but I haven't really specified that so much in my statement. And these ground places is really about public space. You know, when I first started making photographs, cultural and political history were an integral part of my anthropology studies, which is what I studied in undergrad. And it was made really real by the environmental movement, emergence of resistance groups. As a photographer, though, I was uneasy of the kind of one-dimensional documentary style of tragedy and or witnessing disaster. So working in the landscape for me is instinctual, familial, cultural, memorial, looking at the perception of belonging to a place as a visitor on the land, as an immigrant, and not following the norm of straight documentary, nor presenting a lost narrative common in photography. And when I say immigrant, I mean all of us who have come here, even if it was hundreds of years ago. So photography as an invention and a tool played a significant role in Manifest Destiny, in stories of how the West was made, identified, and conquered, from early photographs made for the USGS to privately funded expeditions in search of resources, to the photographs of Edward Curtis's attempts to document the, quote, vanishing race. Photography is linked to settlement, colonization, and the ethnic genocide of the American landscape. Photography also became a tool to witness, and contemporary photographers could be heralds of conservation and preservation, such as Ansel Adams and his tireless work with the Sierra Club. So this type of work continues on in contemporary practice, yet at times it can remain a version of how the land is defined, protected, and seen from a kind of specific perspective. So I'm asking myself all those questions and all the history of photography when I'm going out there and making these very, how do I start with this kind of project? So I just threw these in here. Like I said, no one's seen these. These are, I don't know, I don't want to call them snapshots, but I feel like they were these kind of formal documents of the landscape. Like, am I going to just go out and make pictures, or do I start with this as kind of my sketchbook? These Grand Places visit sites on and is about public land. In a preliminary trip to Oregon Pipe Cactus National Monument in 2019, I witnessed portions of the new US-Mexico border wall replace the existing barrier. I previously lived near the border in both Arizona and New Mexico, but on this visit, I caught a more intimate portrait of lands being bulldozed. A return trip in March 2020 was canceled due to the pandemic, but this year I returned as the previous administration had been pushing very hard to finish as much of the wall as possible. This one image on the left is from the March 2019 visit. So this goes right through the National Monument. And that's a what's called a automobile vehicle barrier, so that cars can't drive across. And this is the new wall. I took this picture on the right 3 days ago. It's just my iPhone, just to kind of show standing in the exact same spot. So having studied at the University of Arizona, I spent many hours in the Center for Creative Photography with Ray, who's in this talk today. Ray and I went to grad school together, looking at the extensive collection of photographs, and also looked at cyanotype proof prints from the glass plates of Edward Curtis, among other photographers, other historical photographers. I followed this historical practice of making contact prints on cyanotype paper in the field. So on the top would be what it would look like if it was printed from the negative, and the bottom was like printed in that Cyanotype process. I like this way of working because, one, it was very friendly during the pandemic, but also I'm thinking about how I'm going to work here in this kind of space, this 7 by 9 foot, it's actually huge studio. So these Grand Places, though, isn't about the border wall, but it's multi-layered. This project intends to look from several perspectives on land use and its stakeholders, the people who are here, policy and protection. And it really takes time to research and photograph, as it's kind of essential to having a deeper inquiry into place. So on process, again, looking at these processes, this one on the bottom is a straight up cyanotype. And then the one on top is bleached with baking soda and then toned with black tea. So looking for non-toxic methods. So my first year on campus at UW-Madison, I went on a cultural landscape walking tour from an Indigenous perspective with Omar Polar, who's one of my collaborators in this project. He posed the question, what if we were to look at this place in a different way, through new eyes? How would that change how we acted? I began this project informally, looking at both myself and others and how we use the land we live on. With the challenge of this new philosophical question, I seek to gather a wide range of how people experience place and how we might see it in a way that shifts our thinking or perhaps changes our behavior. My approach is primarily to listen. After reading an article about environmental laws being waived to build the wall per Department of Homeland Security, I watched a video of a saguaro cactus being bulldozed. Quote, Arizona state law prohibits anyone from harming, shooting, or removing saguaros, which can grow up to more than 45 feet in height and live up to 200 years, according to the U.S. National Park Service. That's a quote from them. So after that video went viral, the defense was that the cacti were being relocated and not bulldozed. So a few months later, I walked along the wall just to see what I might find there. So it was in this particular trip, this isn't from right now, this is from my last trip here, because actually I am here in Arizona. This scouting trip really kind of reflects my relational aspect of how I work. I made sure to take time to have a few conversations. I stopped to talk to rangers at the visitor centers and in the campground. One recommended visiting a natural spring deep in the desert that was home to the endangered fish species and other types of species called Quito Quito Springs, which is this place. And the other for a hike for the best view of the moonrise, which led us into talking about illegal activity that's heightened during the night hours. Also on a walk, I met a couple who were volunteering to band raptors. So try to chat with people along the way and see what they're here for, what they're enjoying doing in these public spaces. So this image is really about process. Oftentimes I place little pieces of cyanotype when I'm on a walk as I walk out and then collect them as I walk back in. A lot of chance, right? So I'm leaving it up to the sun to make the correct exposure. Here is another image. So I'm imprinting plants and rocks, things from the Sonoran Desert, which is one of the most biodiverse areas in the United States. So in January, despite all the craziness of the last year, I really wanted to try to get out into the field as I felt like things were really shifting with a change in policy coming up and what that was going to look like. So I left Madison in this crazy rig in January. There's about 4 inches of ice on the roof. And this is here, and my first place to come was back to Arizona. Here I'm working a little bit with John Kirk, who's a documentary photographer and has been photographing along the border wall, along the entire U.S. International border for months. And he's flying a drone. So I've been working with a drone, so I got some flying lessons from him. And then I just have to say, you never know what the weather is going to hold. So I got to test out what it was like to be very, very cool. Not as cold as Wisconsin, but pretty cold when you don't have electricity or power. Snowfall. And then I'm just going to show you a couple of these. These are on my Instagram pictures. And again, I haven't really shown these to anyone, but just to kind of show you how I'm working the space. So this is following one of the roads that was being built to put up the wall to the end of the road. Just really kind of looking at the landscape. And also like how I might work in this space. This is at a picnic table in Oregon Pipe Cactus National Monument. I always make a couple of, I always make this print every year. It's called my New Year's print. Ray knows because he gets one. Ray, it's coming. You know it's going to be late. It's always late. So I'm printing it right now. And just kind of like how I might assess the landscape. This is hiking up to a ridge and really kind of looking across the landscape and looking for that kind of interruption, that like ribbon of the wall running across the landscape. A visit back to that spring that you saw earlier. This is a couple days ago also. They're doing some restoration work there now. A little bit about what it might look like out in the field. Sometimes I'm a little bit remote. This is very close to the New Mexico border. That was my campsite. And this also is along the New Mexico border, and there's a little sliver of the moon here. So this is a sunrise walk I went to. I wanted to see how far I could walk up this road. Like you can drive some of them, but the road gets really intense, and you will always have a conversation with law enforcement when you're out there. So this Border Patrol agent, I ended up having a really great conversation with, because my goal is to listen, right, to like what are people's perspectives of this experience they're having, also hear whatever their politics are, whatever their viewpoints are, if they're willing to share them. And he was willing to share his, and not only that, he was willing to give me a ride. So we actually drove out. First he said, oh, I was going to give you a ride back across the border. And I said, oh, you want to give me a ride to the end of the road instead? Sorry, you have to have a little bit of humor in these. So this landscape, as it's being dynamited to create roads, to create this wall, which is under assessment now. It's all been paused by executive order. And then on the right, I just want to show you my new camera I've been working with. So it looks a little bit like that old one that I had shown, except for that now it's attached to a digital body, but still has similar movements of the 4x5. So I'm kind of like just trying to think about different processes that I can work with that are that are familiar as far as technique goes, but as far as process, you know, like developing film in here, I'm just trying to kind of think about how I can work in a fluid workflow. But I'm also, of course, making cyanotypes. So here's a view of inside the studio. The printing press. This is literally, actually, I think I took this yesterday to include. And, you know, after all this serious talk, I thought I'd also show that I have my cat with me. That's one of my desks, but he often wants attention. And I want to thank you for your time. Thanks for listening for that last part about these grand places. It's very new. I haven't really discussed it in this kind of format. And I just decided yesterday to throw in these kind of documentary images. So the images I showed you at the end aren't necessarily the kinds of work I'll be like printing and framing or like thinking of as the actual like final outcome of the work, but they're definitely sketches along the way. And I also see Calder Sells in the room. I just want to shout out Calder is a former student of mine who's been helping me as a research assistant, kind of organizing the actual like reading research, organize my homework. He's giving me the homework now, actually, as it turns out.
Gail did have a question that he put in the chat, and that is, are you concerned about the cyanotypes fading?
I don't know if you could tell just from my few pictures. They can fade because they are a light process. So yeah, if you left them in the sunlight, they would eventually fade. Also, if you forget it in your tray of water, it will also disappear, which I think kind of in itself is potentially interesting process. I do actually try to scan all of my cyanotypes, so I have a digital record of them, but I haven't been too concerned about it. Now, I am concerned about things like the platinum print, which is very archival, but still also needs to be careful when exposed to UV light, or any process that was made with UV light is also sensitive to UV light. We might have to fact check that. Most of them are. I'll say most, that way I'll be covered.
When you have these different projects that you're working on, when you get started on a project, do you have like a clear end goal in mind, or is it more exploration and then what comes out of that, or do things change?
That's a great question. Yeah, like I was saying, a lot of times things aren't so linear. I think these grand places would be something great to start with. I actually kind of came up with that title back when I was in grad school, and Ray might remember this. I went up to the Grand Canyon. I felt like I had to take a landscape picture because that's what you're supposed to do. But then there's all this pressure if you're a photographer that it's good, of this like place that you could, it's so monumental. How could you possibly photograph it? I'd rather just go to the gift shop or something and buy a picture. And so I kind of tongue in cheek was like the Grand Canyon, like how could we possibly like actually illustrate what this looks like and do it in a way that might be different. That in 2017, this list came out from the Department of Interior for places to be under review, public lands. And when I read through that list of 23 places, the initial list, at least half of them are places I had lived near or explored or camped or hiked or just had some kind of relationship to. Most of them are in the American West, and some of them are marine reserves. And so I would say that kernel, that idea really started there, and I wanted to like go to all these places, but I didn't want to just like rush to photograph them before they were deforested or whatever might happen there. So I think that's why I was like bringing up all those questions earlier in that talk. So I guess that would be a very kind of classic example of I know it's important to spend time there, and what is it going to become, and trying to like a little bit let myself be led by the experience of what it's like to be out there, and what is it going to be like if I talk to rangers or my neighbors or the border patrol, or like how do those, or protectors, or the native tribal lands that are being bulldozed, you know, although during times of COVID it's a little harder to speak to people face to face. So really kind of letting it be guided by the experience. So occasionally you can do a project where you like start to finish, you're like, I need to do A, B, C, D, E, and then I'll be done. And then sometimes E falls through the cracks or something, but you kind of know the trajectory. But I think particularly the way that I work on a lot of different things at once, and try to like as the work's being made, like let the work guide me. If that doesn't sound a little too ephemeral. Ephemeral is not quite the word. It doesn't sound too wishy-washy. Yeah, try not to be too attached to outcome, because you know it's going to change.
Thank you.
To kind of piggyback off of that, is it kind of the same then with what media you're choosing to work with? You're kind of guiding by your experience and working through the project, and then because you work in like so many different media, especially with your installation with Hatsubun, I mean, there were so many different aspects. Is that something that kind of comes to you as you work through as well?
Yeah, that's a great question. Sometimes, like in some ways, I think everything is an image, even if it's an object. So yeah, it's a matter of like, because you were still visually looking at something, and sometimes it feels like something doesn't want to be a photograph. You know, like the boat for my father, like that had to be physical. That had to be like, it had to have weight. It had to feel like his body. And then I think with video, for me, a lot of it's about the kind of physical experience you have when you're watching something that's time-based, and you're standing there and it's large and it's dark and the water's moving, like that movement can only really be experienced, I think, by either being there or by experiencing something like an immersive video installation. So I try to think about like what the experience I want of what, if you're experiencing the work, what's it going to feel like? Is it something that you can smell and touch, or feel the light on you, or feel the movement of the water, versus looking at a still image and kind of unpacking all the symbols within it. And I like to experiment, and I actually like to work with, if I get too tired of being on the computer, I like to go and carve something. So I think also it kind of gives me, as a maker, a lot of ability to move around and play with different mediums, like, because I really do like working with wood, but I'm not really that good at it, you know. So of course I know I practice more, but so it gives you also this opportunity to think about different ways that you can convey your idea, and how important that material is. So like cyanotype as a material, as a process, can feel really important when the water is really important for me. Like if I want to use source water, that's a wonderful process for it. And I used to use source water with Polaroid negatives, but they quit making it. So I think for me, it's been another way of like inviting the water to be one of the elements of the actual process itself. Is that a good answer?
Yeah, it is. And with these grand places, do you have any? I know you're doing a lot of photography, and you said kind of out of practicality, you have the same 4x5, but it's kind of digital because you're remote, and you're doing some cyanotype. Do you have any other ideas in mind thus far that what media you're gonna incorporate with these grand places?
Yeah, I'm feeling like it's pretty photographic, but I have been collecting some drone video footage. So, and I don't know if that'll just be source material, or if that'll work its way into some kind of video work. I mean, drone footage is drone footage in some ways. It's like you've seen it a lot, so I have to kind of think about how I want to share that. I also been doing these really informal interviews, which Calder will know. I haven't actually brought out my microphone, although I have bought a one for my iPhone, because I think a lot of times when people are talking, they rather have you, I don't know, once the recording device comes out. So there's these kind of informal interview process happening right now. And so I think Jordan, I think those will work its way into there, but I'm not really a documentary worker. I mean, I don't really work in a documentary style, so I wouldn't be doing like a documentary project about something because I don't think that's really my methodology. It doesn't work that way. But I want to incorporate other people's stories. So that part I'm not sure about. That part I'm just gathering right now. I'm trying to write and I make audio recordings of my experiences and like how are those voices going to eventually come into the work? I think that's still a big question mark. A big question mark for me. I kind of feel like it might be through a book,
Okay.
like a
Cool. Just
like a
curious.
reading, like
Thank
a
you.
project. Mm-hmm.
Oh, I'm excited to hear you say that about the book, because I was like thinking about, for one, it always strikes me about how layered your work always is. Like when you, especially when you're talking about your dad, like, and like your relationship with your, all the threes, like that's what like really jumped out at me this time about looking at that work is like you and your mom and your sister. And then these like three circles and three places. And like, for one, like I always think about like, you know, how connected to place it is, but how these other things become places too. And it strikes me in your work, like the ore is a place. That beautiful boat you made for your dad, like with the shadows, like that's a place too. And I don't know, I just like get excited at the thought of you like really being able to share what you write about it. Cause like I don't know. And I just wondered sort of like where your writing comes along in the process.
That's a good question from a writer. I thank you, Ray, for that. I feel like I use Instagram a little bit as a journal, and I actually also write in a journal pretty regularly. I'm a little off track on this trip, but I usually try to write every morning. And I don't tend to edit very much. I just real train of thought, but I feel like when if I want to publish something, because I'm feeling like I feel like there's going to be a book project in here. In fact, I'm already talking with Karen Zimmerman at U of A about doing something, and they have a beautiful book art studio. I don't know if you've been to the new space, Ray, it's gorgeous. We're talking about me doing a residency there post-COVID and working on a letterpress book, small edition book project in which there will be language in it. And it's probably that point I probably should bring in an editor to help me correct. You know, I'm a little off the cuff. But I think that I also have been working with Targol Mesbah, who's a sociologist. She's kind of a consultant on my project. And she's also said to me, don't get too strict with your methodology because it's going to take some of the magic out of it for you. And so I think there's going to be some kind of fine line, like, you know, again, the ABCD. It's like, it's important for me to cover these aspects, but if I lose too much of the serendipity, spontaneity, part of it, will it become too formal or too strict, or it won't have that same kind of sensitivity, I guess, to it. So that'll be a question with the writing. And again, like the stories of other people, the interviews, I feel like those could be in writing, but they won't probably be verbatim. They'll be more like the experience that I had with this drive to the end of the road with this Border Patrol agent, like more like telling that story probably through my words, but also integrating his story within it. Cause I feel like that's maybe the most honest way I could to share that story, was to tell it through my perspective, because I don't want to try speak for someone else. Does that make sense? So I'll probably need your help when I get there. Ray's a fantastic writer, by the way.
Oh, can I ask one more thing really quick?
Yeah.
I was thinking about all the like water incorporation of the water processes. And I was wondering if you, for one, like I'm still sad about those Polaroid negatives going away because of the way they work with the Rattlesnake Lake and the things that they do, the things that the film picks up. And I was just wondering how you were like dealing with like the digital back, and like if you'd figured out if you wanted to do water in this work at all. And I know that's hard probably for the current work, but
yeah, I know I really miss the nature of that Polaroid film, because there was so much possibility for tragedy, actually, and like good ones. You remember we did those snow prints? I've been doing a lot of snow prints with Cyanotypes, by the way, since I got to Wisconsin, because a lot of snow there. So the digital, what I'm thinking with the digital back is, you know, they could be straight up photographs, but I am planning on making digital negatives from them. and then translating them to, I'm kind of really into gum prints, although I don't think I can do them in the studio there, because I could, but there's dichromate involved, which is toxic. But thinking about them, like photographing in that way, switching, making a digital negative, and then working into some other kind of printmaking aspects that will allow me to work with source material. So it could be a cyanotype that's been toned, and then maybe I'll print on top of it or do an imprint on top of that. So I'm kind of really thinking about ways I can layer with it, using source material again, whether it's stones or leaves or native species that I'm not going to damage, or if I'm going to like draw some, like I made some cyanotypes where I drew some, took a little bit of water from the San Pedro River, which is a river that has been concreted over. It's on the international border. It's a pretty intense place. Yeah, so I'm trying, you've been to San Pedro, maybe it's one of the important riparian zones. I mean, there's a gate that they're going to open when it floods. I will see, because when monsoon comes, it can be pretty intense. Yeah, so like I've been able to incorporate that water into the work through Cyanotype, but I think I might be able to incorporate the river in other kinds of ways through maybe like printing processes. So I guess it goes back to what Jordan's question is. There's still a lot of question marks, and I feel pretty new in this space, and I'm working with a lot of new tools, because that's the best way to take a trip. It's like booking a trip to Europe and buying a new pair of shoes and then getting blisters right away. I didn't do that, but I feel like I've read that somewhere. I feel kind of that's where I'm at right now with this work. Repair, and there's been a lot of repairing, so. That's part of the fun though, right?